never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. Let freedom reign. God bless Africa. I thank you.
And 26 years later, that remains but a dream deferred. Our racist past has found its way into our racist present. And sure, the burden of proof remains on the one who alleges racism. The global Black Lives Matter proves that this is not unique to South Africa. Good evening, I'm Aldrin St-Pierre, and this is Unfiltered. Tonight we are joined by clinical psychologist and anti-apartheid activist, Professor Seth Cooper. He's also prominently known for being one of the founding members of the Black Consciousness Movement, along with the late Steve Bantu Biko. We also have Dr. Bani Pityana, who's a human rights lawyer and an academic. Mary Barton, a political activist and former commissioner at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, will also join us, as well as the head of policy at AfriForum, that is, Ernst Roos, will be joining us. And do remember that we always want you to participate and be part of the conversations that we are having. You can do that by going on our social media platforms using the hashtag at SABC News Online or at SABC News Unfiltered. But before we continue, here's a look at this evening's headlines. Public Protector Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane has called on public institutions to reduce cases of maladministration. Mkhwebane released 35 reports implicating a variety of public institutions. ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa says a radical change in the economic landscape is needed. Ramaphosa has called on young people in the ANC Youth League to stand up and radically push for a complete overhaul of the economy to represent the demographics of South Africa. Over the past 2 weeks alone, there have been 14 murders in South Africa, the youngest of a little boy of 4 years old, and the 84-year-old being the eldest. Activists are saying the unbanning of alcohol is partly to blame. Well, we can have more on those and other stories later on this evening, right here on SABC3 with Shante Yankees. But to continue our conversation, speaking exactly about a huge issue, and that issue is racism. As I've indicated, we're joined by clinical psychologist and anti-apartheid activist, Professor Seth Cooper. We'll also be joined by Ernst Roos in just a while. Prof, good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. How do we start by defining racism?
I think racism is something that one grows up with in a society where there is an attempt to look at somebody who does not look like you externally in a different way. Mm-hmm. It is an artificial construct. It is something that we find in quite a few societies where there is diversity, and it is totally unscientific. Mm-hmm. It is often used to oppress and keep down the other. It is that massive attempt to impugn the dignity, the integrity of anybody else who does not fit into the narrow stereotype that I have engendered through my upbringing. It is oppressive to the other and has untold psychological, physical, and economic effects.
Okay, let's quickly bring in Ernst Roos into this conversation as well. Ernst, let's hear your definition of racism and how you understand racism.
Well, it's hard to define racism. Maybe the appropriate way to define it would be to say that racism is like pornography. it's hard to define or to capture in words exactly how to describe it, but you know it when you see it. I don't have a problem with the description given by my colleague just before me.
Okay, wait. You describe racism or equate racism to pornography?
No, I'm not equating it to pornography. I'm saying the phenomenon of having difficulty describing it is the same. I believe it was the Constitutional Court that said on a case dealing with pornography that it's hard to provide an accurate definition that truly encapsulates the phenomenon, but you know it when you see it. And I think it's the same thing with racism. You can ask 1,000 people to define racism, and you will get 1,000 different answers. But we all know what racism is.
Okay, what's your definition of racism?
Well, racism is having particular negative stereotypes about people based on the color of their skin, encouraging hatred towards that people, or harboring views of hatred towards that people, wanting to discriminate against such people, or inflicting or wishing ill will, or wishing ill or disfortune on such people.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that South Africa still suffers from that?
I do. South Africa certainly does suffer from racism, but racism is not nearly the biggest problem that South Africa has to deal with. The vast majority of people have said so repeatedly in opinion surveys that they experience racism in South Africa. But there are many issues that are much bigger problems than racism that needs to be dealt with. But unfortunately, we have the problem where we have a South African government and a ruling party and alliance partners of the ruling party who apparently can't stop talking about racism. And I believe that's why an opinion poll found that 64% of people said that all this talk about racism and colonialism is just an excuse by politicians to deflect the attention from their own failures.
Professor Seth, is it really an excuse?
Well, I think that what we need to do is look at the history of our country. Our country, until 1994, was a totally racist one. It excluded from all decision-making black people. And here I use the definition that has been used constitutionally and is in our law, that all those who previously did not vote for in the general election, that means people of African origin, people of so-called colored and Indian origin in particular, that all those have been excluded from decision-making, have been excluded indeed in most aspects of making decisions about their own lives. What happened in 1994, in the heady days of the 24th of April onwards, and when Nelson Mandela became our founding president, is that we created the basis for this constitutional democracy. But the elephant in the room, racism, was not dealt with. We've got various Chapter 9, organizations, but none dealing with racism. We've deflected the issue. And probably the greatest kind of racism since Nazism, that is apartheid South Africa, was not given the kind of attention. And that's why the issues that Ernest is raising of reactions and outpourings from time to time happen, because we've not dealt with it.
Sure.
It's been shoved under the carpet.
Okay, with that particular point raised, Professor Seth Cooper, when we come back, we're going to have that conversation about how there's always this deflection and there's always this concerted effort to try and create a narrative that, as Ernst Ruiz has put it out, that there are bigger issues to deal with than racism. Is that really the case? Remember that we'd love to hear from you, and you can tweet at SABC News Online. You can also tweet at SABC News Unfiltered just after this break. And welcome back. You're still watching Unfiltered with me, Alderin Simpi. As you can see in the background, I'm joined by Professor Seth Cooper as well as Aaron Swiss as we discuss a very difficult conversation and sometimes a hot potato that needs to be dealt with. And sometimes those conversations do get very uncomfortable. Aaron, earlier on, the point that you made was that from the survey that, survey that was done, it was pointed that there are other pressing issues. What are those pressing issues?
There have been many surveys done on this issue, including surveys by the Institute of Race Relations, Institute of Justice and Reconciliation. There is an organization called Plus 94, and there are many others. And the findings are always the same, that the most pressing issues in South Africa are unemployment, crime, issues dealing with unaccountable government, issues such as corruption, politicians not dealing with people's problems, the education system, and so forth. These are the more important things that need to be dealt with. The amount of people who have said that they believe racism should be the South African government's top priority in a survey by the Institute of Race Relations was 2%. That's 1 out of every 50 people in this country believe that racism is the most important thing that government should be focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Do you at all think that our racist past and our racist present that we live in could be also the result of the high levels of unemployment that we see, especially amongst black people?
Well, certainly that it plays a role. It would be naive and disingenuous to try to deny that.
Sure.
It is, however, important to recognize that there are other and bigger issues that one needs to consider that also plays a role in poverty. And there's been studies about this. One was a book published already in 1984 by the American economist Thomas Sowell, who happens to be black, who dealt with various cases of discrimination and oppression all over the world. And he looked at how Chinese peoples have been oppressed or discriminated against, how Jewish peoples have been oppressed and so forth, Koreans, Irish, Germans, and so forth. And his conclusion was that the way in which a group is being treated by other groups is not as important an indicator of whether that group will be prosperous or poor, as opposed to the work ethic within that group. That's what Thomas Sowell said, and I believe that is an issue that it's very controversial to mention that in the South African context, but it's something that we need to discuss when we talk about unemployment and poverty.
Work ethic? Did you just say work ethic?
Yes. Yes, I quoted Thomas Sowell on work ethic, yes.
And you believe in his hypothesis?
Max Weber said that one of the main reasons why the West is a successful country is because of work ethic. Neil Ferguson, the historian, referred to it as one of the killer applications of the prosperity of the West. So if the hypothesis is that work ethic is one of the issues that lead to prosperity, then sure, that's something you would have to be naive to disagree with, the same way you would have to be naive to regard South Africa's history as irrelevant.
Okay. Professor Cooper, I've got a bit of a problem with what Aaron is saying and the hypothesis that is just quoted now, because for me, it lands as if the argument then becomes that in the majority, the people who are unemployed because they are lazy, that they don't have the proper work ethic.
Well,
it's not entirely what I said.
He's quoting a particular author in this regard, but I mean that view has been expressed variously over the decades. But let's just take a step back.
Mm-hmm.
I want to agree with Ernst on when there is racism, you know it's racist. You can feel the racism, and particularly from the recipients of that racism. They know racism. They feel it. They have kept their peace on it. And it comes from that old apartheid, the Afrikaans phrase, ken jou plek.
Mm-hmm.
So they've known their place and they've shut up about it.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that they don't feel that racism. And you see, for me, this is not an uncomfortable conversation at all, because if you don't discuss it, then it becomes uncomfortable. And unfortunately, for some people, discussions like this become uncomfortable, and therefore they make lots of excuses about it. Now, the surveys that have been conducted, it's who conducts the survey, what are the questions asked, and who responds to that survey. I mean, the methodology is so flawed. The examples used of Max Weber and so on, I mean, I can go to town on slashing those and where they come from. But the important thing is there's a history of slavery, colonialism, on which the West built its fortune. There is a history in our country, extractive economy, where certain people have become wealthy. And I would dare say that since democracy, as a group, Afrikaans-speaking people have been wealthier than they've ever been previous to this period. All the facts speak to that. So to attribute to anybody attitudes, behavior, and so on that they cannot substantiate is the worst kind of racism, because we wouldn't be here with what's been built unless it was a back of black workforce.
Yes.
And that's true elsewhere as well. That's why worldwide there's a call for reparation. You know, we saw that statue in Bristol torn down last week and put into the Avon River. That man made his money from slavery, shipping people out, but he made more money from insurance, from those who died, and they probably killed people on the ships, and probably the insurance company that is Lloyd's of London benefited from that. That's why we need to be careful what we say and how we say it, because the worst thing that can happen in this country for whites is if blacks claim reparation for all they've done. There's current research in this country, but let's go to this. David Williams, a public health specialist at Harvard, has given a litany of areas of dysfunction and ill health that blacks suffer in the US because of the stress of racism. Why do you think in this country, when even decades ago, there wasn't the rise of certain disease progressions, that now Africans in particular suffer from heart and other conditions?
Professor Cooper, let's just quickly
living in a racist society.
Professor Cooper, let's just quickly go to an ad break. When we come back, we'll give you an opportunity to close your remarks, or to sum up and conclude your remarks, and then we'll also hear some remarks from Ernst Ritz as well. Just after this, remember that we still love to hear from you. You can tweet at SABC News Online. You can also tweet at SABC News Unfiltered. And welcome back. As you can see that we're still in conversation with Professor Seth Cooper as well as Ernst Ritz as we discuss racism in South Africa, but also as a global phenomenon. Professor Seth Cooper, just the closing remarks and to end off your thought from just before we went to the break.
Okay, I want to just say that ons is dieselfde. All of us belong to one race, and that's the human race. We are constructed of the same ingredients. And if you take the external trappings out, that is the amount of melanin in your pigmentation, and maybe the shape of some parts of our bodies and the texture of some of our hair and so on. Those are differentiating features. And it would be a boring world if all of us looked like me, spoke like me, thought like me. We should cherish our diversity, be honest and open about our conversations without blaming or finding excuses for the past, and move to recognize that we have to live together or we die together as fools. We need to recognize and acknowledge the diversity, cherish it, and work towards our common humanity in this country. Anything else, relying on stereotypes, relying on diminution of the other, or any superiority or inferiority, impacts on your own integrity and that of everybody else around us. It's time this stopped. It's the 21st century. It is the year 2020. We should embrace the vision that everyone looked forward to for 2020.
Okay.
Our common humanity is what will make us survive.
Thank you so much for that. That is Professor Seth Cooper. Ernst, just a quick response to what Professor Cooper said earlier on, in that Afrikaners have continued to benefit from the system and have probably become much richer under the current democratic dispensation.
Yes, I think that's an important point. Maybe just one or two brief points before that. Firstly, when I made that comment about work ethic, I quoted a black economist in the US who spent his life writing books and doing research, among others, on how to uplift black people in the USA. He did a study about the Chinese in the Southeast, in Southeast Asia, the Germans and the Irish in the USA, the Afrikaners and the British in South Africa, and so forth. And he reached a particular conclusion. But even if you only say what his conclusion was, as happened right now in this discussion, you're accused of promoting some form of an anti-black racist agenda. And that's to accuse Thomas Sowell, who's a black economist, of having an anti-black racist agenda in reaching that conclusion.
Well,
it is an important point.
I'll tell you this, though, Ernst, that being black does not necessarily mean that you are incapable of offending or incapable of being co-opted by even the oppressor. That much we do know. So I am within my right to even critique a black person who seems to be siding with you.
But are you saying that work ethic is not relevant?
No. You evoke the work ethic conversation as we're having a conversation around race and around black representation, even in the workplace. You spoke about unemployment, and the hypothesis that you're coming up with is an hypothesis that says that we should be focusing on work ethic instead of focusing on race.
We should be focusing on work ethic. We should be focusing on culture. We should be focusing on oppression, which is, of course, the only thing that we're allowed to talk about, oppression. And we should focus on, and that's the next point, and that links to the comment about Afrikaners getting wealthier. We should focus on government dependency and economic policy, because what's happened, it's true that Afrikaners in particular have become richer, wealthier since 1994, or more particularly, wealthier as a result of black economic empowerment. And it's very ironic. And the reason why is because Afrikaners, or white people, if you want to talk about it racially, have been forced out of the government sphere, where they were to an extent dependent on government, and they were forced to say, well, if you want to survive, you have to start becoming creative. You need to become an entrepreneur if you want to get money. So Afrikaners were shifted out of the government sphere, and they started their own businesses. And now, ironically, being discriminated against made them richer. That's the problem that we have in South Africa, is that black people are being made dependent on the South African government through economic policies. Poor black people are made dependent on social grants. Middle-class black people are made dependent on preferential treatment as a result of affirmative action policies. And wealthy black people are made dependent on government through black economic empowerment and
Ernst, just quickly hold that. We just have to quickly say goodbye to our SABC 3 viewers. But the conversation continues on the SABC News channel that is on 404. Apologies for that, Ernst. You can continue.
Sure, no problem.
Sure, you can continue. You can sum up your remarks. Yeah.
Oh, great. No, I think that's the point. So we need to talk about things like work ethic. If you sit at, but it's not so much work ethic. It's also being trapped by government policy. So if you have a situation where you do not work, and because of the fact that you do not work, you get money by the South African government, what's the incentive for you to go to work, to start looking for a job? Because if you start looking for a job, you stop getting money from the South African government. So the South African government is making people dependent on the state, and that's probably the most significant factor that's leading to the inequality that we have in South Africa. So if you really want to fix the inequality problem, if you really want to fix the unemployment problem, the number one thing to do is to stop making people dependent on the South African government through these race-based policies.
Okay, let me ask you this. With the economic hegemony and having white people right at the top and something that we've inherited, and the status quo still remain, what then can you point to and say that this is what white South Africa has done to dislodge the status quo, to ensure that black people also come into the economy, because white people are the owners of the economy and they run the economy?
Well, that's not true that white people run the economy. That's just a propaganda quip that the ANC wants us to believe. White people don't run the South African economy. What have white people done? Before the BEE laws were implemented in 1996, a survey was done among companies that were mostly owned by white people and run by white people. 90% of these companies already had transformation and black empowerment policies in place, even before government required of them to do so. The question, what have white people done to address the inequality, is founded in what is part of the problem. It is founded in the notion that what needs to happen is redistribution, and then we're going to solve the problem. The fact is redistribution doesn't work. It hasn't worked anyway. There's no case study in global history where redistribution of wealth has successfully led to equality. There's no example. Even in Cuba, where under Fidel Castro, inequality increased. So redistribution is not going to work. The only way to really fix the problem would be to make sure that people are not dependent on the South African government, or at least it's not the only way, but I think it's the most significant thing that needs to happen in South Africa.
Okay. Who is at the helm of the economy? Who owns the wealth of this country in its majority?
I don't know. You were the one who mentioned that. Maybe you should give me the statistics on that.
No.
The fact is that companies, how many exclusively white-owned companies are there? Companies boards exist of white and black people. We can talk about all of this. There are these fabricated figures about the JSE floating around, which I believe was stated by Jacob Zuma during his presidency, which have been dispelled, but people still quote them. People still quote these inaccurate figures about land ownership, claiming that white people own 80% of the land. It isn't true. You can say, yes, on average, the average white person in this country is more wealthy than the average black person. That's obviously so. But to use that and to reach a conclusion that white people own the economy, that's just ludicrous.
Okay. So on average, you say that white people are wealthier than black people, right? That's the conclusion.
Sure. Yes.
Okay. So then we look into the majority. Who's the majority in this country? Is the majority black? Yeah.
Well, if you want to talk about race, then yes.
Yes, the majority is black. Is it not strange to you that while you still have a minority, which is white, that minority still has, as you've now put it, is averagely more wealthier than a black South African?
No, it's not strange. It's a logical conclusion of what the South African government has done since 1994.
No, but what have white people done?
Because the South African...
Aaron's, it's okay that we keep on blaming the government, but what have white people done? What have white people done with the vast tracts of lands?
We keep on blaming white.
No. You are speaking about government and the failures of government. So now I'm taking it to white South Africa. And I'm saying, white South Africa, since 1994, what have you done to include black people in the economy and also to ensure that there is a redistribution of wealth?
Why should there be a redistribution of wealth? There should be a creation of wealth. Redistribution of wealth doesn't work. Name me one example where it has worked. One example in global history where redistribution of wealth has led to an increase in equality. Name me one example in world history.
Okay, let's just quickly bring in...
So the question then is, what should white people do?
Yes, what should white people do?
Well, I think white people should act according to the law. White people should be the same as black people. They should act according to the law. They should have proper work ethic. They should point out when their colleagues and so forth are being racist or discriminatory. And I believe in the vast majority of cases this is happening. The problem, and with all due respect, but the underlying assumption on which your questions are based is the reason why we have such inequality in this country. Because it's about blame, it's about not allowing any narrative other than blaming other people for your current situation.
But we haven't had any acceptance from white people that one of the reasons that we have the status quo is because white people have been enjoying this. They have been benefiting from the fruits of this.
In this conversation,
huh?
I accepted it just a few minutes ago. The only thing I'm saying is that's not the only reason. The problem is that the narrative in this country, and the narrative with all due respect that you are perpetuating now, is you can only be poor as a result of someone having oppressed you or stolen from you. That's the only explanation that you're allowed to give. And you can only be wealthy on the basis that you have stolen from someone else or oppressed someone else. Any other facts that you add to the discussion is regarded as racist or oppressive or taboo, to say the least.
Okay. Professor, we have Pani Pityana also joining us in this conversation. Pityana, good evening and welcome to Unfiltered. So the conversation that we're having now is we've moved on now focusing on the economy and how the economy relatively remains white. And the argument from Ernst is that that is not the case, that is not true. How do we understand the makeup of this economy when the... Excuse me, Ernst, you want to say?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay.
I said the majority. I said white people are on average wealthier than black people, but it's false to say that white people own the economy. That's what I said.
Okay. So his distinction is that it's not true that white people own the economy. From your observation in understanding how the economy operates and how the economy functions, from a race perspective, what can you tell us?
Thank you very much, and good evening to your viewers. The obvious fact is that the South African economy has been structurally unfair and unequal. It's a structural matter. It's a historic matter. It's always been like that. It was designed for a purpose of benefiting a certain section of the population for all these years. So the structures of the economy haven't changed very much, actually, since 1994. And so they do continue to weigh on the inequalities of the past. So the issue, rather than, for a moment, I don't want to use the race, but I do want to say that we must come to terms with the fact that our economic system is unfair and unequal, and that is the structures and the manner in which it had been designed deliberately throughout the history. So 1994 actually wasn't going to affect and didn't change the structure of the economy fundamentally. I, for one, am hoping with the president saying that post-COVID, we're going to see a new restructured economy. I'm hoping that the pillars of the economy will be designed in a manner that is a lot more fair and equal than had been the case up to now.
And how do you do that when we've had, for instance, and I still maintain this, Ernst, but I'll get Ndate Pityana to respond to this quickly before I come to you. How do you do that when, as you've argued, that it is structural? It is structural in the point that even, for instance, if you want to get money from the bank, you'd need to show that you have some collateral. But as a black person in the majority, how many do have that collateral?
I don't think anybody can deny that inequality has been structural and systemic. It's the nature of the beast. It's the nature of how the economic system was designed and how it functions. By its nature, it is functioned. In fact, it was functioning so that it can benefit a minority of the people of the country. Historically, that's how it was. What 1994 did was to slot in black people into that system and those who could slot into the system were slotted in, and so you have a growing black middle class, educated, functionally black middle class. It's true you have many black people who have become very wealthy in terms of the system, but the underlying nature of the system disadvantages the vast majority of black people in this country.
Okay, let's quickly, Ernst, a quick response to you on that.
Well, I think what we need in this country, if we want to solve this problem, and I'm not denying that the problem exists, but so the question is, how do we solve it? We need a very, very serious injection of empiricism in this country. And what I mean by empiricism is to start moving away from these utopian ideas of redistribution and creating the ultimate paradise and the Garden of Eden if the government just enforces some policy, and to start looking about world history, and particularly economic world history, and to see which policies actually work and which policies don't work. Because we keep going back to the argument is so one-dimensional, and it's the only line of reasoning that you would not be shunned for in the South African public discourse. And the argument is South Africa's past was evil, therefore we need redistribution of wealth. Redistribution of wealth was tried in the Soviet Union, it was tried in communist China, in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Cambodia. It was tried in all of these countries. There's not a single example where it has led to some form of economic success. The only way to reach economic success is to have firstly a longer term solution that isn't utopian, to say we need to firstly secure property rights. We need to ensure that we have proper work ethic. We need to ensure that people are not made dependent on government, that there must be incentive for people. What the South African government is doing is the exact opposite. It's taking away the incentive by making people dependent on government through social grants and race-based preferential treatment and so on, and so forth. So the consequence would be the exact opposite in what the policy intends to achieve.
Okay, let's bring into this conversation Mary Barton, who is a political activist as well as a former commissioner at the TRC Commission. Good evening, Mary, and welcome to Unfiltered. The conversation that we're having and focusing on the economy, for instance, now, and Ernst Ritz arguing that redistribution is not the answer to the challenges that we are currently facing. Then what is the answer from your point of view?
Thank you very much, and good evening to the other participants and also to people who are watching. I've been able to follow some of the discussion.
Sure.
And I do believe that we are living at a time in South Africa when the structural inequality of the past is still very powerfully with us. And then the question is, has the government done the right things to change those relationships? And are we doing the right things now? And can we do them again? And I hear the arguments about there isn't a work ethic and that people are becoming accustomed to looking to the government for support. I cannot believe that there is anything we can do in this country except provide social security for the millions of people who at the moment do not have the capacity to enter the workforce that there is in this country. So what we need to do is actually, as I understand it, and I wasn't alive at the time probably, that a good one of the ways in which Afrikaans-speaking people in the past were helped to move from rural areas to city areas, were helped with education and with financial assistance to get that toe in the door, to enable you to take that step up from abject poverty. The government has tried to do many things. It's tried to have a broad-based affirmative action and trying to get people into jobs. It has increased the social security distribution and eliminated racial discrimination within those grant services. But we need to give everybody in the system a chance to get a bus fare, to go and look for a job, or to find some tools to create a job, or to get the education that is going to allow them to move out of that abject poverty. You can't do it without that. There needs to be a support base that helps people to get that first step forward. And education, we need the education desperately.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It is perhaps the top item on the agenda, but it takes time. You don't see people coming out of an educational system for at least 10 years or so, probably longer than that. So those, to me, are the biggest things, the safety blanket and the education.
Okay, sorry, who was that?
This is Bani Pichana.
Okay, yes, you can go ahead.
Mary, thank you very much, and you, Ernst, as well. Let me just say that Ernst is being very selective in his examples and in his memory. Following the First World War, there was a huge movement in the United Kingdom, John Milton Keynes, and the first Labour government after the war in England, in Britain, actually did an enormous amount of work in enabling the state and the management and the way in which the state was organized, the public resources were organized to benefit the poor and the poorest, and the enablement of industrialization to take place as well, etc. So within living memory, we've got clear examples, contrary to what he's saying. If you go to Sweden, for example, you find a social democratic environment here that really, honestly, doesn't simply seek to do down the poor. It brings up the poor in order to make them worthy and productive and active members in the economy. What we need in South Africa, quite honestly, to add to what Mary has just said, what we need in South Africa can no longer anymore be a country that is based to benefit the wealthy and the middle class, which it has been for so long. We need more directly a developmental state that seeks to make available the public resources in order to uplift the poorest of the poor.
Yeah.
With massive programs in housing, in water provision, massive programs in infrastructure development, massive programs in agriculture, massive programs. So the wealth of the country, which at the moment, including mining and agriculture, by and large, all of these things actually benefit the minority. Among that minority, by the way, now there are black people as well.
Yeah.
It's not uniformly white, but it still is the minority in a country that is based in Africa. The large number of people are not able to access healthcare, are not able to have decent education or housing or something like that. Now I'm hoping that when the president is promising post-COVID, that we can begin to learn lessons from John Maynard Keynes and others in order to really restructure the economy in a way that is diametrically opposite to what we have done up to now.
Okay, Ernst,
so we need to rejig the economy differently.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Ernst, what does that economy look like?
Well, firstly, I think we should be learning lessons not so much from John Maynard Keynes, but from people like von Hayek and others who had some different views. Just on Sweden, near the end of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, the Secretary General, was trying to determine how can they save the socialism of the Soviet Union. And one of his advisors said to him, what we need is a Swedish model of socialism. And Gorbachev turned to him and said, well, where are we going to get all the Swedes? And obviously he was making a joke, but there's an element of truth in that. Firstly, if we want to talk about Swedish socialism, we should firstly recognize that Sweden didn't become rich or wealthy because of socialist policies. It now has socialist policies after becoming rich and wealthy as a result of free market policies. We cannot, we can talk about Swedish socialism, but we're not Swedes, we're South Africans. And I know it's very, very politically incorrect or controversial to mention anything about that hasn't to bring any phenomenon to the table that isn't the reason why we have inequalities because of oppression.
Yeah.
Just during the start of this lockdown, you know how many schools have been vandalized, robbed, or torched? It's almost 1,000. It's 962 schools who have been vandalized. Now, if you can recognize that, but if you say we have a cultural problem in this country. With culture, I mean the way in which we act, the way in which we organize our lives. Then suddenly it becomes racist and politically incorrect and taboo and so forth.
Okay.
As long as the discussion is censored in terms of what you can say and what you cannot say, fearing that you might be accused of racism or being an evil person, we're not going to have a proper discussion. We have a one-dimensional discussion. The discussion is we had oppression, our past was exclusively evil. Then we had this wonderful new dispensation starting in 1994, and the solution is one-dimensional. We must have redistribution policies.
Okay.
It's one-dimensional, it's naive, it's disconnected from reality.
Okay, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so let me just quickly have Mary take the last bite. Mary, what does the future look like if we are unable to deal with racism, including racism as displayed through economic ownership?
I think we are able to deal with racism, not in a hurry. Racism is going to be with us for a long time because it's too entrenched. And it's not South Africa only, it's a world thing, because racism is built on power and privilege. And that means not only between black and white people in South Africa, it means between countries that are wealthy, countries that are like ours, have great disparities between rich and poor. And that fosters racism. You can't really have racism if everybody has the same chance in life. It wouldn't happen. It would go away. It's because of that entrenched inequality that the problem arises. The question is, what do we do about it? And I believe that we are at a moment in history, partly because of the virus, partly because of the way that the whole question of Black Lives Matter has arisen to the surface at the moment. It's a slight opening in which we can talk about these things. And yes, they are painful and they make us angry. But white people have got to acknowledge that we bear with us our ancestry. And whether our great-great-great-great-grandparents were explorers or colonialists or brave people who went, like people who go into space now, that's not our fault.
Yeah.
But we carry the privilege that comes with it.
Thank you so much.
And so white people have to learn.
Thank you so much for that, Mary Baton. And I think that is spot on, that you may not be the colonizer yourself, but you still benefit from colonialism. You continue to be a beneficiary of colonialism, including the laws that protect your property. It's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching Unfiltered, and thank you so much to our guests as well. Goodbye.